How y'all doing?
All right.
As we wait for my stuff to come up here, I'm going old school today. I hope y'all don't mind. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I just like to have a conversation with everybody today. And before we get started, I just want to greet you in the tradition of the movement that I grew up in from the time I was a freshman in college, which definitely was influenced by Dr. Franz Fanon, the movement of the New African Independence Movement. I'd like to greet you with Free the Land.
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 By any means necessary.
Ashe.
There we go. My conversation today was called Reclaiming Franz Fanon, African and De-colonial Legacies for Family Therapy Practices. I'm a family therapist. I've been doing this work for the last 30 or so years, first in Los Angeles, where I was telling Dr. King, very much influenced by the Fanon Center. In fact, my master's thesis was just quoted him liberally back in the 80s. And I believe that I became a family therapist because I believe that that approach to doing psychotherapy is closest to African people. It's relational. It understands that problems are not in people's heads, but that problems exist in the space between us and our relationships. In fact, for the African, that's even where the personality exists, not in the head, but in the eyes of our brothers or sisters. And so that was my influence on particularly working around systemic and relational therapy. And so I'd like to talk about this idea of reclaiming Franz Fanon to that practice. For over half a century, Dr. Franz Fanon has been remembered as a philosopher of revolution, a champion of decoloniality, a founder of post-colonialism, but only rarely is his mental health work discussed, even though to the end of his life, Fanon considered his psychotherapeutic work as his primary identity. However, despite his significance as a contributor to clinical practice, cultural issues, and family life, Fanon and his ideas have rarely, if ever, been included in the thinking about and practice of psychotherapy or family therapy. This seems important now when so much space seems to be taken up in writing and at therapeutic conferences on issues of cultural competency, cross-cultural counseling, multicultural therapy. As significant as Fanon's contributions to mental health practice are, his ideas, techniques, and theories in this area are rarely discussed. Since the last decades of the 20th century, Western psychology has been influenced by the thinking of so-called postmodern thinkers like Michel Foucault, Jürgen Habermas, the various members of the Frankfurt School, and others who challenged the positivist constructions of the late 19th and 20th century. Now, in this talk, I want to argue that just as postmodern ideas have been imported to the development of deconstructionist and dialogical approaches to Western psychology, the anti-colonial and decolonizing ideas of Franz Fanon hold tremendous significance for decolonizing therapeutic practices for African and other colonized people. This paper will engage with some of the ideas and practices of Fanon garnered from the seminal self-analysis and contemplation of racial identity in his first book, Black Skin, White Mask, as well as his ongoing theorizing and clinical papers on the impact of colonization and decolonizing on individuals, families, and wider societies found in A Dying Colonialism and the Wretched of the Earth. I want to also draw from Fanon's recently released clinical writings found in a book called Alienation and Freedom, where all of his clinical writings have been brought together. To reclaim Franz Fanon's clinical legacy in this way is in service to decolonizing mental health practice in the West and is placed in service to African people. Fanon understood that colonization was both external, expressed in military occupation of land, exploitation of material resources and labor, cultural degradation, and structural violence, as well as internal and expressed as imposing what he called an inferiority complex, the zone of non-being on the oppressed. This inferiority complex results in an inordinate dependence on white ideas, validation and persistent self-hatred, and negation of the culture and people of the colonized. This is often expressed in what Du Bois called double consciousness. Reclaiming ideas, traditions, cultural ways, and healing methods indigenous to our own people is the first step toward decolonizing mental health and rebuilding confidence in our people's ability to be self-determining and self-reliant in the face of ongoing Eurocentric coloniality. Fanon has been divorced from conversations on mental health practice primarily because of the association of his ideas with violence. He has been both praised for and accused of being a prophet of violence. This is primarily a response to the first chapter of his final and best book, The Wretched of the Earth. The chapter entitled simply On Violence begins eloquently with the claim, decolonization is always a violent event. However, we need to be clear. Fanon is not here advocating or prescribing violence as a solution to colonization. He is describing violence as a pervasive, all-encompassing, and existential reality in the lived experience of colonized people as they resist oppression. Violence is the context which shapes and defines relationships between the colonizer and the colonized, between various groups and classes of the colonized, and even between sections of the colonizers themselves. Violence shapes the social, political, cultural, psychological processes of everybody involved. Violence is the guiding theme of the decolonization process. It is in violence that a distinct cultural national identity of the colonized is developed and distinguished from the dominant culture. For the African community in America, this is violence in the context of white supremacy and Eurocentric domination. Fanon argues that violence has been the defining theme from the very beginning of the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. As violent force was exerted to subdue and make the colonized subservient to the colonizer, and every act of resistance was responded to with more violence. Yes, somehow violence is only named when it's perpetrated by the oppressed. We can talk about violence when Hamas does it, but let's not talk about the bombing and murdering of thousands of people this time, and over the last 75 years, millions of people dead because of the violence of the colonizer. The violence of the oppressor toward the oppressed is never named as violence because it is legal and it's legitimate and backed by the force of colonial authority. It is assumed to be in the service of law and order. But even beyond the assertion of violence in maintaining law and order, colonial violence is even more insidious and pervasive. Fanon saw the violence of colonialism as existing under the violence of decolonization. Dr. Bulhan is also helpful here in understanding Fanon's ideas on the psychology of oppression when he gives us a definition of violence which highlights Fanon's thinking. He writes that violence is, quote, any relation process, or condition by which an individual or group violates the physical, social, and/or psychological integrity of another person or group. From this perspective, violence inhibits human growth, negates inherent potential, limits productive living, and causes death. Close quote. With this understanding, then, violence may include the individual person hitting or stabbing or shooting another person, yeah. It might be explosions in war zones or groups of people burning and destroying a city. It might be that. However, in addition to these commonly accepted acts, violence is inclusive also of the everyday deprivation of a healthy environment, or lack of good medical care and nutritious food sources in poor and working class Black communities. Violence is also the daily uncertainty created by extrajudicial assaults and killings of Black men, women, and children by police and vigilante forces. Violence is experienced when people live in poor or no housing, or when living space is disrupted by capricious gentrification. Violence is experienced with mass incarceration and the denial of education. It is a violent act when people are denied a voice in the political process. All these practices violate the physical, social, and psychological integrity of African individuals and communities in America. These realities can be shown to inhibit human growth, negate inherent potential, limit productive living, and they lead to death. This is the ongoing, everyday, state-sponsored violence of coloniality. These are also the social context which generate conditions for poor mental health in African communities in America. This is what Fanon would call the sociogenic causes of mental disorders among colonized people. Fanon believed that this structural state violence is an existential reality which is rooted in the very act of colonizing itself, and which is made more evident when people resist colonization. When I emphasize this point, I'm not trying to deny that Fanon, is an advocate of national liberation struggle, did not support violent physical resistance to colonialism. He did. He believed in picking up the gun. In The Wretched of the Earth, in fact, he wrote, quote, "At the level of individuals, violence is a cleansing force. It frees the native from his inferiority complex and from his despair and inaction. It makes him fearless and restores his self-respect." Close quote. I'm saying here that Fanon did not glorify or privilege violence as some have posited, claiming that he prescribed violence as a so-called catharsis for the oppressed who commit acts of violence on the colonizer. For Fanon, the focus is not on the acts of violence of the oppressed toward the oppressor, but on the psychological impact of intentional acts of confrontation and resistance to stand up to the oppressor. Dr. Bullhorn again clarifies this mischaracterization, which he says is perpetrated by non-clinicians. You know what, folks who use all kinds of psychological language but never went to school for it? You know, your clients who come in and they've already assessed that their husband or their wife is a narcissist, right? Because they heard it a couple of years ago on the news, right? But these non-clinicians who don't understand the difference between what in Fanon's book is called disintoxication, expressed in English as a cleansing force, and catharsis. Dr. Bullhorn again writes, quote, "Fanon's argument was that conscious and determined confrontation of the oppressed was unavoidable if the oppressed are to rehabilitate themselves, and this confrontation was necessarily collective and goal-directed, unquote. As the oppressed stand up to and confront their oppression, toxic feelings of inferiority, toxic feelings of alienation and double consciousness, toxic feelings of being in the zone of non-being, feeling like you don't even exist in the world, are cleansed from them individually and collectively. They face the thing they fear and confront the source of their own dehumanization. Through resistance and confrontation, the oppressed can break through double consciousness and the zone of non-being. That haunting thought that, like my grandmama used to say, the white man's ice is always colder. Or the awareness that the world of the colonizer, one is never able to simply be a man or simply be a woman. You always got to be a black man. You always got to be a black woman. You're always just outside of a normal human being. This constant awareness of perpetual inferiority and marginalization in the context of whiteness is an act of existential psychological violence. Every Black Lives Matter demonstration shutting down a city, every Mobile, Alabama riverboat dust-up, every time Black workers organize and demand to be recognized is an act of disintoxication. Fanon believed that this unjust violence on the lives of the colonized, resulting in a petrifying sense of inferiority, could only be broken by symmetrical confrontation in defense of humanity. Writing about this subject in 1963 and understanding that social, cultural, and psychological questions must always be placed in historical context, Fanon saw violent resistance to colonization as feasible at that time based on his analysis of the current historical situation. Fanon was clear as he discussed national liberation and violence that this was in the context of a world just coming out of a world war, which weakened European colonizers and sparked the independence of several former colonies in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. It was also a world where China and the Soviet Union were challenging the hegemony of the capitalist world. Fanon wrote in analyzing when it was time to have violence. He said, quote, "Hardened by the unconditional support of the socialist countries, the colonized hurl themselves with whatever weapons they possess against the impregnable citadel of colonialism. Although the citadel is invincible against knives and bare hands, its invincibility crumbles when we take into account the context of the Cold War." In other words, we ain't just trying to go out fight for no reason. We want to make sure that we can win this fight, or that we at least have a good chance of winning this fight. So Fanon's emphasis is not on violence for the sake of violence or for some abstract notion of catharsis, but it is on resistance to domination and the outcome of psychological decolonization, which is elimination of the feeling of inferiority and dehumanization, which is caused by colonization. We also see that Fanon's discussion of violence as a tool to this end is not grounded in an irrational lust for violence, but is based on a sound analysis of the current historical world situation at that time. That being noted, I would ask how these ideas might inform our thinking today. I believe that if we can accept Fanon's reliance on making analysis in historical context and understanding that his call for violence was in the context of a historical period which was supported such action, and that his primary interest was not violence, but the dismantling of the feelings of inferiority imposed by structural racism and colonialism, his main point is that as the colonized collectively resist and challenge institutions and practices of structural oppression which colonize the lives and minds of the oppressed, they will become psychologically liberated as they fight more effectively for their social, political, and cultural liberation. For Fanon, mental health and psychotherapy must always be considered in cultural and social context. He argued that all mental disorders are social relational circumstances. He argued that when human beings are alienated from other humans, from nature, from familiar social institutions, etc., they also become alienated psychologically from themselves. Alienation, psychological fracturing, is manufactured in the oppressive conditions of colonial society. Colonialism has a purpose: the exploitation and manipulation of the powerless poor for the political, economic, and military benefit of the powerful rich. The psychological impact of colonialism is internalized racial self-hatred, inordinate dependence on validation by the oppressor, and disrupted relationships between the colonized peoples. Colonization contributes to the experience of alienation and condemns the colonized to perpetually being in what Fanon called the zone of non-being. This way of understanding Fanon and reclaiming his ideas for decolonizing mental health for African people suggests 5 assumptions. 1, coloniality for Africans in America is still defined by the institutional violence of structural racism, which inhibits human growth, negates inherent potential, limits productive living, and causes death. Secondly, this institutional violence produces a psychological outcome of alienation, double consciousness, and cultural inferiority among African Americans. Africans in America. 3, alienation, double consciousness, and cultural inferiority disrupts supportive, interpersonal, and mutually beneficial social relationships amongst Africans in America. 4, providing decolonizing, focused, relational psychotherapy, inviting individuals, families, and communities to critically question experiences of double consciousness, alienation, inferiority, helps to negate the psychological impact of institutional violence and racist coloniality on oppressed people. And finally, African-centered institution building and organized resistance demanding social justice disintoxifies alienation, double consciousness, and cultural inferiority. This resistance does not necessitate violence on the part of the oppressed. What is necessary for disintoxication is collective, self-determining actions of resistance to oppression, which may include cultural resistance, political resistance, economic organizing, social institution building, etc., all in the interest of becoming a people for themselves rather than simply being a people in themselves. As I close out, it's important to emphasize here that even decolonized mental health practices are not in themselves liberating. Psychotherapy is not revolution. This is another lesson learned from the example of Franz Fanon, who used his training as a psychotherapist to help restore Algerian freedom fighters to states of mental health while coordinating those efforts with the work of the wider liberation movement in the service of social justice. When decolonizing mental health is understood as more than a metaphor, and coloniality is understood as the social and political context which impacts the lived experiences and mental health of Africans in America, then providing therapy for our people has meaning beyond simply aiding people in accepting their place in an oppressive society. The work of providing mental health care becomes a cultural resource for strengthening people's sense of cultural being and helping them to develop a critical consciousness to move beyond social, cultural, and political limit perceptions. Thank you.